Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. In today's video, we are going to be doing something a little different because we're going to be circling back to a moment that we've already looked at in a previous video. And we're going to do this in order to re-examine that moment in light of some additional context that has fairly recently been brought to my attention. Now, in many ways, I'm fairly certain that the title of this video is going to be a pretty big clue as to what we're talking about, but just in case. Today, we're examining that account of Edward VI, the frankly disturbing performance that this young king puts on before his governors that involved a falcon. Now, I will be leaving the original video that I made about Edward VI linked in my description box, but since I filmed that video, the plot has most certainly thickened. And so, without further ado, let's take a look at it. I want to start by saying an absolutely massive thank you to Deanna for emailing me about this topic. And on top of that, another big thank you for taking the time to send me the appropriate source that we're going to be discussing today. I really am so very grateful to you. Today's video is going to be ending with a whole bunch of questions, and I'm really looking forward to reading all of your responses in the Premier's live chat and or in the comment section beneath the video. Today's topic also offers us a fairly unique opportunity to lift the veil, so to speak, on the work of historical investigation. We're going to be deep diving the sources to explore questions of their provenance and context. And this practice is, in many ways, the very cornerstone of historical study. Let's start with the account that I referenced in that first video on Edward VI. Now, the first time I heard anything about Edward VI plucking a falcon as some kind of threat seemingly aimed at those who were overseeing his realm and person during his minority was during a conversation with Janet Wortman, whose novel on Edward, called The Boy King, was published back in 2020. Pretty much as soon as that conversation ended, I was on the hunt, looking to find any and all sources that reference this particular event. And as I recounted in my video on Edward VI, I have, thus far at least, only found one contemporaneous reference to it. That reference has been translated from French, decoded where necessary, digitised and then reproduced on this site, British History Online. As we can see, this source comes from the Calendar of State Papers of Spain. It's from volume 10, which covers the years 1550 to 1552. It is a letter dated to the 21st of March 1551 from Simon Renard, the Spanish ambassador to the Emperor, and in this letter he includes the following, quote, "Incidentally, I will add the account of an act which is said to have been committed by the King of England. He is said to have plucked a falcon which he kept in his private chamber, and torn it into 4 pieces, saying as he did so to his governors that he likened himself to the falcon, whom everyone plucked, but that he would pluck them too thereafter, and tear them in 4 parts. I have heard the truth of the story certified by people whose testimony should place it beyond doubt. But nevertheless, Ambassador Mason denies it, and accuses President Montluc of having excogitated it entirely himself. For those of you that have already watched the video on Edward VI, I am sure that all of this is going to be sounding very familiar. However, soon after that particular video went live, Deanna emailed me to inform me of a nearly identical account that came from an earlier source, and that earlier source can also be found on British History Online. In this case, as we can see, the source in question comes from the Calendar of State Papers relating to English affairs in the archives of Venice. It is from volume 2, which spans the years 1509 to 1519. This earlier letter was from Niccolo di Favri of Treviso. He was an individual who was attached to the Venetian embassy in England. And it was sent to Francesco Grandenigo, who was the son-in-law of Andrea Badoa, the Venetian ambassador to England at this time. This letter was sent from London on the 24th September 1514, and a record of it was subsequently entered into the diary of Marino Sanuto on October the 30th, 1514, presumably not too long after it would have been received. An excerpt from this letter reads as follows, quote, "It was said that when the Prince of Castile heard that his promised bride had been given to the King of France, he went immediately into his council chamber and said to his councillors, 'Well, am I to have my wife as you promised me?' with other words to that effect. Whereupon his councillors answered him, 'You are young, but the King of France is the first king in Christendom, and having no wife, it rests with him to take for his queen any woman he pleases.' And thus did they seek to excuse themselves." During this conversation, Duke Charles, looking out of a window, saw a man with a hawk on his fist, and calling one of his councillors, who was his chief friend, said to him, "I prithee, go buy me that hawk." The councillor replied, "I know that hawk. He is a young bird, and does not yet know how to quarry. He is not a bird for your lordship." The prince said again, "I prithee, go buy it." The councillor, still seeking to excuse himself, the Duke at length exclaimed, "Come with me." So he bought it himself, and put it on his fist. Then, having returned into the council chamber and seated himself, he commenced plucking the hawk. The councillor meanwhile inquiring, "Sir, what are you doing?" The Duke still continued plucking the bird, and when he had done so to his heart's content, made answer, "Thou askest me why I plucked this hawk. He is young, you see, and has not yet been trained. And because he is young, he is held in small account. And because he is young, he squeaked not when I plucked him. Thus have you done by me. I am young. You have plucked me at your good pleasure, and because I was young, I knew not how to complain. But bear in mind that for the future, I shall pluck you." He also used other very strong language. So it seems that nearly 40 years before the report about Edward VI was made, indeed more than 20 years before Edward was even born, that this account of Charles was both produced and sent. So let's take a look at the provenance for each of these sources. When we attempt to evaluate the veracity or otherwise of primary sources, there are several things to consider, and corroboration is a really massive one. We're going to ask ourselves, are there other roughly contemporary sources that are saying the same or perhaps similar things? The issue with these sources is that in the case of both of them, that I have looked and there is nothing extant, or at least there's nothing that I've been able to find so far. So we haven't got corroboration. Okay, let's look at context. In 1514, Charles was just 14 years old. He was the Duke of Burgundy, and was also referred to as the Prince of Castile. Within just a few years, however, he would become the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The marriage that was being arranged for the French king, Louis XII, which apparently so enraged the young Duke Charles, was between Louis XII and Mary Tudor. She was the 18-year-old sister of King Henry VIII. Henry's wife, Catherine of Aragon, was Charles's maternal aunt. That Charles would be angry about the breaking of his promised marriage is, I think, understandable. It was, after all, a public political slight, and as such, it was likely that it would have been embarrassing to him. Additionally, though, Mary was a famed beauty. She was not that much older than Charles. Perhaps the fact that she was being married off to the king of a rival nation, who happened to be 34 years her senior and in poor health, is something that might have created a personal wound for Charles too. When we assess sources, we must also consider the author and the intended audience. In the case of the report about Charles, it is a Venetian one, ostensibly made for Venetian eyes. It was written in London. So we should perhaps question how this story about Charles's behaviour is reaching the author of the letter, Nicolas de Favre. His closest connections are going to be at the English court at this point, and it's the English court that are making the marriage between Mary and Louis XII. Of course, while he's at court, he is also going to be interacting and meeting with the other ambassadors who are also doing similar work to him in the same place. We are told in the letter that, quote, "It was said that when the Prince of Castile heard that his promised bride had been given to the King of France, etc., etc." It was said, we are told. But said by whom? Was it perhaps said by a member of the English court? Or maybe by another foreign ambassador to it, in which case were they French, maybe imperial, or indeed from some other nation altogether? Should it perhaps be read simply as idle gossip? Something designed to surprise, maybe even entertain the intended reader? Or was it shared as a warning of Charles's intentions for the future, either by those who were seeking to bolster his power on the international stage, or perhaps by those wishing to present him as an unstable danger whose power should be curtailed by whatever means could be found? So now, let's bear this in mind as we return to re-examine the letter that deals with Edward's behaviour. This account was written when Edward was 13 years old. He would be turning 14 just a few months later, and 14 was the age that Charles was when a similar account was written of him, so Edward is doing it all a few months earlier. Should we read this as some sign of precocity in the young king? And is that supposed to be a good thing or a bad thing? The account comes in a letter from the Imperial Ambassador Simon Renard. He was first ambassador to France and then to England, and he is writing to his master, the Emperor. In 1551, when this letter is written, Renard was still serving in France. This letter is sent from Blois. The emperor he is writing to is Charles V. Surely it is highly unlikely that this is a coincidence, that the emperor's ambassador is reporting back to him that the boy king of England is behaving almost exactly the same way as he did, at almost exactly the same age, when dealing with disappointment. So what was happening in Edward's England at this time? Well, in 1551, Edward's council was being led by the Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley. This was following a court coup against the king's uncle, Edward Seymour, who, before his downfall, was known as Protector Somerset. Uncle Edward would ultimately be executed for treason in the following January of 1552. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, like much of Roman Catholic Christendom, was highly concerned about the radical changes to the faith that had and were continuing to take place in Edward's England. Charles may have been especially invested in this particular matter due to the effect it would have been having on his cousin, who was Edward's half-sister Mary. No doubt Charles V would have been mindful about the potential danger that these changes to the faith might have put Mary in, both spiritually and physically. Indeed, the year before this letter was sent, plans were being made to help Mary to escape her brother's reforms and England itself. The ambassador Mason, who, according to Renard, denied this claim, was the English ambassador to the French court at this time, while President Montluc, who Mason reportedly accused of being the inventor of the account, is most probably Jean de Montluc, a French nobleman, diplomat and clergyman. When it comes to Jean de Montluc, he, how do I say this, really got about a bit during his time as a diplomat. He worked in Rome, in Venice, the Ottoman Empire and the British Isles. Indeed, he was reportedly in Scotland in 1550, which is of course not long before this letter was sent. Did he perhaps hear this account of Edward's behaviour while he was at the Scottish court? And if so, does that perhaps indicate that it was an attempt by a Scottish courtier to in some way discredit this English boy king? After all, Scotland and England for many centuries did not have a particularly peaceful relationship. Is it alternatively possible that Montluc had heard echoes of the Venetian accounts of Charles V when he was there in the 1540s, that he then repackaged them to include Edward in the subsequent years. Was Jean de Montluc's repackaged account then repeated to Charles V in a letter from one of his own diplomats? There is, I would say, a key and very interesting difference between these two accounts, because in the account about Edward, unlike that of Charles, we aren't given an inciting incident to explain Edward's behaviour. So are we supposed to infer it? If so, what should we infer? Should we infer that Edward has been angered by the changes to faith in England? Does he then think they are going too far? Or not far or fast enough? Alternatively, is this account intended to be a sign, perhaps a warning, of what the new Northumberland regime intended? Perhaps, instead, it was also about marriage, as the frustration of Charles had been. Was Edward displeased that negotiations for him to marry Princess Elizabeth of France were not proceeding swiftly enough, or that another potential spouse for him, Mary Queen of Scots, had been spirited away to France just a couple of years earlier? Either way, I think we also have to question, how is Charles V going to read this? And I suppose, for me, that's going to boil down to a few things. Firstly, did Charles actually pluck the hawk? And if he didn't, did he know of, or even start, the rumour about him doing so? If the answer is yes to any of these questions, then I think that this letter is going to be read very differently to if the answers were no in any case. For additional context with regards to both of these sources, I think we should also consider the significance of falcons and falconry historically. Because to rear and train a falcon, and let's bear in mind there were a variety of types of falcon, and the particular kind of falcon that was raised to be used by kings, that is an expensive and time-consuming process, both to obtain the bird and to train it up and then to keep it. Doing so, having these birds of prey, are also a marker of social position. With this in mind, let's turn to the Book of St Albans, which dates to 1486 and includes the following passage. An eagle for an emperor, a gerfalcon for a king, a peregrine for a prince, a saker for a knight, a merlin for a lady, a goshawk for a yeoman, a sparrowhawk for a priest, a musket for a holy water clerk, a kestrel for a knave. For emperors, kings, princes and nobles, in most cases, on top of the outlay of buying the falcon, paying to have them trained, there is an additional cost. Because to maintain this bird, its health and skills, would also require the continued employment of at least one specialist falconer, who would form part of the household, a person to pay, another mouth to feed. This, as I said, was an expensive pastime. But it was more than simply a hobby for emperors, kings, princes and noblemen, because animal husbandry was often used as a metaphor for both personality and leadership qualities in this time. For example, if a king proved themselves to be able to handle a falcon properly, deftly, even gracefully, if they showed their willingness to strike the appropriate balance between firmness and gentleness, in order to get that falcon to do their bidding, that was frequently used as a positive sign or metaphor for that monarch's rule, both at the time and for the future. Let's remember that these are dangerous birds with incredibly sharp talons, and yet here they sit, tamely on the fist of a king, ready, willing and able to do just as he commands. I think the parallel with royal councils and with the population in general is one that can be easily made. The just king, the righteous king, should likewise keep a grasp on his subjects. That strikes the appropriate balance between firmness and gentleness. And in return, those subjects will accept his authority and do his bidding. So what then should we make of the killing, plucking and tearing? Is it a sign of tyranny? or perhaps a lack of awareness about the value of something that they are so needlessly destroying out of some kind of spite or to make a point? Alternatively, is it instead an appropriate signal, something that could be used by a royal person that, due to their age, had been denied their rightful authority? I'd also like to point out that when I started to look into this account about Edward, I had always assumed that if it had in fact occurred, that the falcon in question would have needed to have been dead beforehand. But with that being said, that particular detail isn't specified in this source. And in the account about Charles and the hawk, it certainly appears that the hawk in question was very much alive when the plucking began. So does that mean that we should assume that Edward's falcon was too? If so, that requires the plucking and tearing of a living bird. And I'm sure I'm not going to be the only one to view this particular fact in this way, because I think it's somehow much more disturbing and violent. Although perhaps that's just the way that we view it from a contemporary viewpoint, the way that animals are seen today. There is, though, one thing that I think goes without question, and that is that these birds, whether falcon or hawk, would naturally fight. And that I think their strength would make it nearly impossible for any person, and particularly for a child or adolescent, to escape from such a violent encounter without being pretty badly hurt. Unless, of course, we are supposed to believe that Charles and Edward had such natural control over these powerful creatures that they simply submitted to their torment, that they did so without complaint. If, though, the bird was dead, well then I think we have other questions to confront. Was the bird killed for the purpose of making the show? Because if so, I think that reads as an act that is both unnecessarily cruel and also extraordinarily financially wasteful. Alternatively, is it possible that the death of the bird was caused by some other means, perhaps natural causes? And thus, was the alleged plucking and tearing in fact a response to the shock and sadness at the bird's demise? A shock and sadness that showed its face when confronted with another form of disappointment. I did search for any earlier references to reports of individuals plucking birds of prey in front of an audience that they were hoping to make a point to, but so far, apart from a parable that I am about to recount which doesn't really do the same thing, I haven't found another extant example, at least not yet. As for the parable, it is about the 13th century Mongol ruler Genghis Khan, who apparently stabbed his favourite falcon for repeatedly knocking his drinking cup out of his hand, only for Genghis Khan to subsequently discover that the stream water he was looking to consume would have been highly poisonous. According to the story, when he realised this, Genghis Khan carried the dead falcon back to his encampment. When there, he ordered that a gold figurine be made to honour this creature. On one wing he had engraved, "Even when a friend does something you don't like, he continues to be your friend." While on the other wing he had engraved, "Any action committed in anger is an action doomed to failure." I recognise that this is a very different kind of account, a very different take, if you will. As here, the death of the bird teaches the ruler a lesson that he then imparts to those around him through the statue he commissions of the bird. Before we finish, I would like us to return to thinking about the two sources that have formed our principal focus during this video, because as I said at the beginning, I have questions and they remain in place, and so let's look at those. How true do you think that these early modern accounts of bird plucking actually are? Do you think that Charles did in fact do it as a boy in order to make a point? Was this action then attributed to Edward later in order to present a similar impression of him? Was it perhaps intended to be a warning? Is it possible that neither of them did it? That in fact the story has an older history, one that was repurposed to send a message, first about Charles and then about Edward, or maybe they both did it, or just Edward did it, in which case I'm going to argue that the safest bet is to say that Edward, or more likely someone who was advising or coaching him, and for the culprit for that, I am looking squarely at Northumberland, but whoever, this individual is looking to put on a show, like the one that was attributed to Charles. I mean, surely that makes more logical sense rather than Edward just coincidentally doing essentially the same thing as Charles, right? But what do you think of these sources, of the way that we have looked into them, investigated them today? On that note, would you be interested in me doing another video like this, but on sources that are connected to a different event? I have got one that sprung to mind, namely the alleged execution of George, Duke of Clarence, in that vat of Malmsey wine. Would a look at those sources be of interest? Also, please do let me know if you would like that one, or indeed another event explored. As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comment section underneath this video. I would also really appreciate it if you popped an emoji, or a social glyph, as we're calling them now. Let's go for birds, and that might be fitting or perhaps upsetting, depending on how you feel about the sources. But if you could pop that in the comment section, because the more engagement a video gets, the more YouTube will share it, and that will help us to grow this community. You can also find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to all the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do consider following me over on some or all of those so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, why not share it with your friends? Indeed, if you like the channel, perhaps you have some pals that might like it too if you tell them about it. You can let me know that you like this particular video by hitting the thumbs up. Please do subscribe to the channel, and if you think you're subscribed, have a little check right now. Make sure that YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you against your will. While you're there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down that will appear, so that way YouTube will allegedly tell you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.